Zdenek Burian was born in 1905 in Stramberg, near Koprivnica, Moravia, which was at that time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. While at school, Burian's exceptional artistic talent was noticed by his art teacher, who persuaded Burian's parents to send their son to formal, more advanced study in Prague. And in 1919, at the age of only 14, he passed the entrance exam to the Academy of Fine Arts in the city. But he wasn't happy there, and less than 2 years later, he left the city and returned to the Moravian countryside to live with others in a ruralist commune. And he spent much of his time there developing his skills without benefit of formal tuition. In the early 1920s and still in his teens, Burian started to receive commissions for book and magazine work, and it didn't take long before several of Prague's more prominent publishing houses started to take notice. It was in 1924 that he first worked for the publisher Stanislav Nicolau, and this professional relationship would endure for 2 decades. Among other publications, Nicolau was responsible for the magazine Across the World, and Burian's contributions appeared regularly in line-only and monochrome halftone. In 1927 he married Františka Ludová, and not long after their daughter Eva was born. In the same year he also began to illustrate magazines and adventure novels for the Vilimek publishing house, and the relationship, like that between Burian and Nicolau, lasted until the company folded 2 decades later. The illustrations he created for both publishers were frequently reproduced from his painted originals, usually with remarkable control of gouache, and occasionally he used oils with similar success. The only example that I found from this period in colour was this impressive wildlife painting, and whether it was actually published I couldn't say with any authority. And although the bulk of his output continued to be monochrome, around the turn of the decade full colour began to appear with increasing frequency. By this time he had become an extremely popular choice for both book and magazine illustrations, and although he seems to have tackled virtually every genre, historical or contemporary period and geographic location imaginable for a wide variety of authors, with a level of productivity that leaves me in awe, it was undoubtedly his work on Western-themed novels for which he was most in demand. Some were translated from American originals, but there are also quite a few by European authors such as the German writer Karl May. Like all his work, the exhaustive visual research he undertook led to highly plausible images, and unfortunately as nothing seems to be recorded, we can only speculate about his methods in that regard. And although there's no reliable evidence that he used live models or photographs to produce his figure work, it's surely unthinkable that he didn't. Among the illustrations Burian created in the early 1930s was a collection for a prehistorically themed serialized magazine story by the writer Eduard Storch, which was subsequently noticed by Josef Augusta, a professor of paleontology at Prague's Charles University. Augusta was impressed with the credibility of these illustrations, and he approached Burian to see if he would be willing to create illustrations in support of his ongoing research into prehistoric life. Burian's ability to make the impossible appear plausibly real was precisely what Augusta needed to enhance the work he'd been doing, and although there had been earlier illustrators who had created worthy but rather stiffly posed images of dinosaurs, Burian brought a new, unexpected level of animation and muscular authority to his depiction. At this stage, the illustrations he created for Augusta were for academic use only, and as far as the public were concerned, he remained, at least for now, an illustrator of adventure stories. And in that capacity in 1937, he took on Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. All the dramatic images for this edition of the book were rendered as gouache paintings and printed in tonal monochrome, featuring exceptional definition and atmospheric lighting. They were a clear demonstration of his uncanny ability to force the reader to suspend their disbelief and to give Verne's outlandish adventure narratives real substance, with the cinematic approach varying from image to image, with distant elevated positions to closer quarter action with immense success. By this time, Burian was also working for another publishing house, Trzymski and Moravec, and in 1938 he illustrated the first of what would be a large series of archetypal British adventure stories about Biggles, written by Captain W. E. John. The page illustrations for each story were all reproduced in black and white from Burian's compelling and well-observed and posed graphite originals. And like all his other adventure work, they too were eagerly devoured by the public. But unfortunately, back in the real world in 1939, Hitler's troops marched into Prague, and Czechoslovakia spent the next 6 years under their rule. But although he was nothing like as prolific as he had been, it seems Burian was left alone to pursue his manifestly non-threatening work. And in 1940, his edition of Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book was published, but of course only in his own country, given that the world was at war. The book contained a mix of colour illustrations and a large number of monochromes, executed in a far more brutalist, almost woodcut style, quite unlike any of his other pen drawings, but they were no less effective for that. It appears he was also allowed to continue his association with Joseph Augusta, and he illustrated 2 books written by his academic mentor during the years of occupation. Despite its misleading title, A Busy Life was an informed work of speculation about the daily lives of dinosaurs from millions of years ago, which provided Burian with the opportunity to create a collection of drawings and paintings to bring the academic narrative to life. A year later, Wonders of the Ancient World was also published, and this large volume of around 750 pages chronicled the development and evolution of life on Earth. And for this considerable undertaking, Burian supplied 25 paintings in both oils and gouache, and over 60 line drawings to illuminate the text. And despite the fact of the German occupation, these books constituted the first time the pair's combined work had been seen by the Czech public. When the war ended in 1945, Czechoslovakia regained its independence, and in 1946 Dan Gopal Mukherjee's Indian story Fierce Face the Tiger was published. The monochromes in this book were executed with a highly expressive calligraphic brushline, and in every case what was left out of any given picture was as vital to the end result as what had been included. But however impressive they were surely overshadowed by a collection of remarkable absorbing colour paintings which illuminated the story with total authority. Once again I find myself speculating as to the nature of the research he would have undertaken for this collection of credible images of tigers in the wild. But whatever his methods and sources had been, the results were both breathtaking and immaculate. In the following year, and with an obviously rekindled enthusiasm for adventure work, he also published a remarkably energetically rendered edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. The book contained numerous impressive sepia drawings of characters and scenes throughout this rousing adventure classic, and there was also a collection of dark dramatic paintings reproduced in full colour to make this surely one of the most impressive and memorable interpretations of this widely illustrated story. And he followed this success in 1948 with another equally rousing classic adventure story, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. It was no less of an achievement and gave Burian an ideal opportunity to return to depictions of Native American adventure with his usual visual panache and plausibility. But 1948 was also the year that Czechoslovakia found itself the victim of a Soviet Union-backed communist coup. And unfortunately for Burian, the publishing businesses he had been working for were put under immediate state control. And the publication of adventure stories written by decadent capitalist Westerners was very much frowned on by his new masters. Nevertheless, in 1949, another Jules Verne novel with Burian's illustrations, an edition of The Mysterious Island, was published, with a collection of typically energised, imaginative tonal monochromes. But it would be some considerable time before he would be able to return to adventure fiction. Luckily, it seems the critics had no similar disdain for his paleontological work, and Burian's association with Augusta continued, and at least a couple of prehistorically themed studies were condoned and published. In 1955, the director Karel Zeman made the film Journey to the Beginning of Time, which was heavily influenced in visual terms by the images Burian had been creating, although it seems he wasn't credited, even if Augusta was. In the following year, Augusta's book Animals of Prehistoric Times was published, with a large volume of paintings from Burian. In pictorial terms, much of the material had already been created earlier in their relationship, although there was also a significant amount of illustration created specifically for this project. But whether it was recycled or new, the visual content of this book was executed with Burian's expected combination of skill, authenticity and imagination. Some of the illustrations were tonal monochrome, but the great majority were painted and reproduced in full colour. And despite the tensions of the ongoing Cold War between communist and capitalist countries, the book was published with translations into many languages. And for the first time, the name Zdenek Burian became known and admired outside his home country. Despite the earlier contempt shown for his fiction illustrations, it seems that by the middle of the decade there were some signs of thawing in the communist authorities' attitudes. And in 1956, Plutonia, a novel originally published in 1915 by the Russian writer and academic Vladimir Obruchev, was published in an edition copiously illustrated by Burian. It contained both black and white pen drawings and full-colour painted illustrations, and although it's tempting to relegate the monochromes to lesser status simply because of the sheer breathtaking quality and accomplishment of the colour images, they were just as expressive and still deserving of considerable respect and admiration. 1956 also saw the publication of another undoubted classic, with Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. This book also boasted a collection of fine, visually satisfying paintings, which were particularly effective in their evocation of the jungle island Crusoe finds himself stranded on following his shipwreck. And as with Plutonia, there were yet more pen and ink monochromes frequently dotted throughout the book to keep the story moving along and vividly real in the reader's mind. 1956 also saw the first publication of From the Depth of Age, featuring a collection of typically convincing pen and ink drawings, which despite looking as if they had just appeared spontaneously on the page, were actually the results of much research and aesthetic consideration. And a year later, another similar collaboration with a title which translates somewhat oddly as Blown Away Life followed suit. Once again, the monochromes he produced were every bit as telling as his colour work, and the artful combination of page white, solid blacks and carefully selected areas of hatching resulted in illustrations which could hold the viewer's attention for quite some time. In the later 1950s and early 60s, there was a continuing softening of the attitude of the Czech authorities, and at that time Burian illustrated 3 of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan books, reproduced in tonal monochrome from his gouache originals. For some reason they weren't published outside Czechoslovakia until the 1970s, but when they were, they met naturally enough with considerable admiration from the fans of Burroughs' work, and they've been reprinted with the original English text several times since. The by now international popularity of Burian's association with Augusta continued to thrive, and in 1960 they had another popular success with the publication of Prehistoric Man, which, as the title indicates, was an examination of the lives of our ancient predecessors and their evolution into the dominant species on the planet. But animal life was far from ignored by the pair, and in the early 60s they published yet more books about the lives of dinosaurs from countless millions of years before, a subject which by this point had become immensely popular with contemporary humans of all ages. Milos Václav-Kratochvil's book Discoverers and Conquerors was published in 1962, and in many ways this could be considered to have been a picture book for adults and older children. It was a historical record of significant figures which provided Burian with the opportunity to create a collection of fascinating black and sepia images which incorporated appropriate maps and physical locations with portraits and key scenes in the lives of the book's subjects, using both line drawings and tonal gouache renders. The result was a highly successful, creatively considered body of absorbing single and double-page spreads, and the book sold well, easily as much for Burian's contribution as of that of the author. But for the next few years it was the paleontological works of Joseph Augusta that occupied him to the apparently total exclusion of all else. And by now it was manifest to all, and presumably Augusta himself, that it was Burian's relentlessly engrossing depictions of the ancient world in both colour and monochrome which underpinned the unprecedented success of the books published. And if proof of that was needed, in 1963 a book of mammoths was published, and the many credible and frequently dramatic colour compositions he created for the book undoubtedly widened its popular appeal to the extent that it was arguably the quality of the dramatic and frequently cinematically composed painted images which was the main driving force in the unusually large sales of the book. The following year's book of prehistoric sea monsters had the added bonus of swirling undersea compositions and scenes of battle for supremacy between a long line of terrifying but fascinating creatures. And in 1966 this theme was further explored with the Book of Monsters, another quite sensationalist title with an examination of similar scenes on land and a cast of truly grotesque creatures to keep the reader fascinated and full of wonder. Even with the obviously huge commitment to his association with Augusta, it seems Burian was still being published in Czech magazines with both monochrome and colour illustration of various kinds. How he found the time I can't begin to imagine. Unfortunately, Joseph Augusta died in 1968, bringing their association of more than 3 decades to an end. But not much later, Burian began another fruitful collaboration with another respected paleontologist, Zdenek Burian. His relationship with Spinar wasn't exclusive, and in 1971 Burian illustrated a long-running series of articles by the zoologist Vratislav Mazak, gathered under the collective title From the Ancestry of Man, which was yet another account of the lives of our distant forebears. And in the following year, Spinar's picture book titled Life Before Man, which was dominated by Burian's immense pictorial contribution, was published in no less than 18 languages around the world, and further enhanced Burian's reputation as the leading and most influential paleontological illustrator of the time. As with a lot of his images, they had been created years and even decades earlier as a consequence of his previous association with Augusta. And so it continued throughout the 1970s, with any number of academics seeking to enhance their own profiles as scientific worthies by publishing books with Burian images. 1974's The Dawn of Man, with text by Joseph Wolfe, was another example of this plunder, with images originally created for no less than 6 Augusta books. At this time, Burian also worked increasingly from an ethnological perspective, with equally absorbing and educational images of the lives of tribal and indigenous people around the world. In 1977, he began work on a cycle of paintings for the gallery of the Dvorkrolové Zoo. Of the intended 34 paintings, he managed to complete 22 of them. He created the last of these in the summer of 1981, and Zdenek Burian died later that year in Prague at the age of 76. Burian had a 6-decade-long career, during which time he created untold thousands of illustrations, and his reputation in what became the Czech Republic when they gained their independence in 1989 has continued undiminished. Not only is there the gallery at the zoo, which houses 150 of his paintings, but the Moravian Regional Museum is also home to quite a bit of his output. There are websites too, although the best of them doesn't have an English translation. And for those who favour books, it seems quite a few, particularly of the paleontological kind, are still in print, and mercifully for the rest of us, they are translated from the Czech original. And I hope that the many astonishing images I've used in this video, including the examples I'm running to the end with, will introduce his work to a far wider international audience and enhance his reputation accordingly.